Good afternoon. My name is Mark Evanier. I'm going to let each of these people introduce themselves individually and tell you their Ray Bradbury influenced me, and or how I met Ray Bradbury, and or that great personal encounter I had, and or what he meant to me story. We'll go down the dais, and then we're going to ask you in the audience to join in. Anything you want to say or ask about Ray, a personal experience you have. I met Ray when I was about 13 years old in person. I had met him before that, reading his stories. Most of us, I think, who had any encounter with the man had that two-pronged experience, reading the stories first and then meeting the guy. And probably all of us at some point in our life have had an experience where we met a favorite writer or a favorite star or a favorite comic book artist and were really disappointed and wish we hadn't met the person because it poisoned our enjoyment of their work. And then there's people like Ray Bradbury, who I don't think disappointed anyone in his entire life. I met him, a bunch of us science fiction comic fans were invited up to his office, which he had in a building at Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills. And we were invited for what we thought was going to be a half an hour. It turned out about 4 hours. And then he invited me back. Because of the group, I was the only one who was actually thinking of becoming a professional writer. The rest were just guys who just loved comics, and one or two of them were people who just wanted to do an interview with him for their fanzines so they could put their name on, Ray Bradbury interview on the cover. I think that was the extent of their interest in him. But I was genuinely interested in him, not so much because of the stories, but because this guy was a guy who wrote every day. He was a guy who was a role model for any kind of writer. You didn't have to be a writer of his Ray Bradbury style material. He was a man who took writing seriously, and I knew that even going in. And he gave us hours and hours. At first it was because we reminded him of him at an early age. He told us stories about his early days in science fiction fandom and clubs and going to early world cons and such. And by the end of the afternoon, he was talking to me mostly about the discipline of writing, the necessity to take it seriously, the necessity to not over-dramatize it. And I just thought that was just wonderful. And he invited me back for a one-on-one, and it was never anything to do with reading he didn't read anything I wrote. He just talked to me as a person who could be a writer. Not as an equal, because I was not an equal, but not as an inferior, because all I was at worst was him years before he sold anything. And that did a lot for me, to be talked to like that, to be talked to with dignity like that. Then over the years, I met him because I had, as wonderful as he was, I could do something he couldn't do. I could drive. And I kept driving him home from conventions. I'd see him at conventions, I'd run into him at science fiction conventions, there were a lot of them down at the Biltmore, down as fantasy and science fiction conventions, witchcraft and sorcery conventions down at the Biltmore downtown. I'd run into him there, and I'd go, "Ray, want to drive a ride home?" And he'd say, "Sure." And I would drive him home, and he'd invite me in, and I'd spend another 2 hours sitting there listening to the man tell stories. And I would make a great contribution to the conversation. I'd say something like, "So what was it like working with John Huston?" And there's a half an hour of stories. He was a great storyteller. Over the last few years, I was honored to be asked to interview him at the Comic-Con a number of times. And it was difficult because A, he was Ray Bradbury. He was in a wheelchair. He was having trouble sometimes focusing. And he really didn't have any new stories, so I was just prompting old stories, and it was nice because we were sitting the first time I did this, I think we were in a room that had 6,000 people, and it was about full. They don't have a room that's 6,000 anymore upstairs. They've now carved them up, in the condominiums or something. But we were there, and there must have been 5,000 people in that room, and I started getting I asked him a couple of impromptu questions. He didn't really have answers, and I asked him to tell a story, a specific story I knew I'd heard. And he launched into it. It was like he clicked in, and he told the most wonderful, long, 20-minute story. I looked out, and there were all these faces just enraptured out there, people listening. And there were a surprising number of kids, young kids, who had been brought there by their parents, I want you to meet this man. And I could see on their faces, and later on I heard them say this out loud, where do I get one of these books? Where do I get one of that man's books? And I thought, wow, there's a magic there of reaching people like that and just zeroing in on them, because his stories were all very humble stories about him at various ages, where he had human foibles and human needs and curiosities that we all have. You can identify with everything, and you can identify with his fears and his hopes and dreams. He's a very human man, very organic. And I just, the work is the work, and we all can read those stories as we will forever and enjoy them. And I don't think I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that guy, because the guy was just a fascinating man, and he was an influence. It's like a conceit to say he was an influence on me, because he was an influence on everyone. But I just was so proud that I had him in my life a little bit, that I had those treasured moments. So anyway, Lisa, would you introduce yourself and tell them your story?
I am in such amazing company, and I am a newer author. I have 4 books out, and if you ever find me online or read my blog, you know that Ray Bradbury, I give him all the credit for my books getting published. If any of you out there are writers and you want to be published, you know about the cycle of rejection. Oh my gosh, so much rejection. And I had come to writing, I was having a really rough patch in my life, and I wrote a bunch of short stories, and I loved it. Oh my gosh, I wrote every day. And then I sold some short stories, and I was a finalist for a Bram Stoker Award. I was like, oh my gosh, maybe I should write a novel. And I did. I wrote the book of my heart, and I started piling up the rejections until it got to where I didn't want to write anymore. It was like somebody stole my love. It was horrible. And then I met Ray Bradbury. I was working with Word San Diego, was a literary paper for a few years here, and we brought Ray down, and so everyone on staff got to meet him. And I had never met Ray before. I had read his books. He was in a wheelchair. He was hard of hearing. But I was stunned by, he was so alive. I had never met a more alive person. His eyes, he was so alive. And here I was, and I asked him, could he recommend something to make me a better writer? And I thought I was asking for a writing book, because there must be a recipe, right? I must be doing something wrong. And Ray smiled at me and pat my hand, and he said, that is the best question. You know what you should do? You should write a different short story every week for a year. He said, you'll have ideas to last a lifetime, you'll be a different writer. And I walked away going, oh my gosh, a short story a week for a year? And I had already sold short stories, so I realized you weren't going to make very much money. And then it hit me a couple weeks after that what Ray was telling me was, this isn't about the money, it's about the love. You used to love to write. And so I did it, and it was so much fun. I did it for 18 months. So I ended with, well, now I have over 100 short stories, so I've published some, but I did end up getting my novel published. I did get an agent, and I have a whole other series that came out of all those short stories. And then the second time I met Ray, I told him what he had done, and he was, I'm sure he didn't remember meeting me, but he was very polite. And but what he said was, don't ever stop loving words. He said, because when publishers, he mentioned movies. He wrote a lot of movie scripts. He said, God, don't ever write for Hollywood. But that was his other advice. But he really set it in for me that he knew when he gave me that assignment, he knew that to write, you have to write because you love it, and you have to do it every day because you love it. He used to tell stories about Electrico, that was my favorite, and the other thing that amazed me was he would talk about that he's in this wheelchair, and he said something about my health isn't what I would like, but I wake up every day and go, oh my gosh, I get to write again today. And he was talking about you need to do what you love. You get this life, don't throw it away on stuff you don't love. And so anyway, as a newbie writer, the best gift that Ray ever gave me was he gave me the love back for words, because don't let anybody take that from you. And Ray, I think Ray is still out there, and I love that they made the rover landing the Ray Bradbury landing on Mars. Yeah. It's had some wine.
It is. Our microphone is tipsy. David Clark took me to San Diego Auditorium. I forget who was driving. Was it your mom or was it my mom?
My mom.
His mother was a trooper getting us out to these things. We were both like 16. And Ray was giving a lecture there. And I've told this story in the program book too, the beginning of this. The lecture was great. We were just wildly enthusiastic. And we had a screenplay we wanted to deliver to Ray for his approval of a film that we were writing for our high school production of A Sound of Thunder.
I have it here on
Yes, at that point about a $35 million movie if you could get it made, of which we had about $35. And we were ambitious. We had Scott Shaw and John Pound. John Pound's mother loaned us her office for filming, and Scott Shaw loaned us, his father was working at San Diego Zoo, so they loaned us the San Diego Zoo. And we thought, you know, this script would work. We handed it to Ray, and then Phil Tippett, who David also knew, handed in their version of the script for A Sound of Thunder. And we all kind of formed a really interesting grouping at that point. Ray wrote to both of us, says, well, you know, this is fun. And if you go to the details about what to do if we actually made the films. And the friendship was fast from that point on between all of us. Between Phil Tippett, Ray Bradbury, me, Phil later went on to correspond with Ray, I went on to correspond with Ray. Ray would exchange postcards and letters with David. He was just a constant machine of communication for all of us. We would later go up to Los Angeles quite often and hang out up there. We went with John Pound one time, it's 1968 I believe.
Rather like Mark's
experience. Yeah. And we got passes to go see, I believe it was Illustrated Man at Warner Brothers. Was that trip?
Yeah, it was a sneak.
No, that was a 1970 trip. Anyway, 1970, we go out to have lunch with Ray. My grandmother drives us, and she has to have lunch with us, and she's you know, totally flabbergasted to be having lunch with all of these young kids and Ray Bradbury. And we go to Frescati's in Beverly Hills. And we have a wonderful, and I order a hamburger, and Ray says, bless you, my son. Because that's all he really liked to eat was hamburgers and milkshakes. And we had a wonderful lunch, and drove him back home, and my grandmother's car conked out on the way home. She had to go in the service station. She was very embarrassed. Ray took it all in stride. He probably had it happen 100 times before, having fans drive him to conventions. And for 40 years thereafter, we've been friends. We got him into Comic-Con. He kept going to Comic-Con. He loved Comic-Con. Just every single chance he could get until the very end. Corresponded, visited him whenever we were down in LA, talked about this, and ended up, as I was doing book signings, as I became a professional writer, which was going to reflect what George is going to tell you about the 60s, I think, is that Ray had groups of people around him that he nurtured, that he loved, and that he talked with. Well, this group was a pretty broad group of kids, but there I was, signing books in bookstores in LA, and Ray would show up in his tennis tops, white shorts, you know, white tennis shirt, and he would show up, and all the people in line for my books was, oh my God, I didn't know he was going to be here. I didn't bring my Bradbury book. So eventually the bookstore owners decided they've got to stock Bradbury whenever Bear is in town. We'd go out and have lunch, dinner, whatever. One memorable dinner was about 1993. Ray and I go out to dinner, and he's sitting there, we're talking about, complaining about all sorts of stuff. You know, Ray would love to talk bright stuff, but every so often he would sit there and describe it. So he was ruminating about what had happened on Something Wicked This Way Comes. And one of his great friends, director Jack Clayton, had kind of had a mental breakdown on that set. Directors often do this, but for Clayton it was pretty serious, and so he handed in the movie was kind of in the can, but it wasn't what Disney wanted. But along the way, the process for Ray was agonizing, because they were actually filming his script. Disney had done this. Disney loved Ray Bradbury. Ray loved Disney productions. He worked in all different aspects of it. He was kind of like, you know, a favored son at Disney. But still, they were having to rework this, and his director had faded out. At one point, John Clayton meets Ray in the studio, and they're on the pathway, and Clayton kind of picks Ray up bodily and moves him aside and just continues going. That's a friendship of 20 years at that point, kind of falling apart. And Ray was agonized by this. You often heard Ray being cheerful, but to talk about this and sit there and say, you know, why was he like that? I had the same experience after about 1983. I was taking him, driving him to digital productions to just get out to see this studio. We'd done this, taking him out to Cascade Studios back in the 70s. Now he's going to digital productions, which will make him the last Starfighter at that point. And I was doing an article for Omni, which they never published. But anyway, we get in there, and I use Ray as a Trojan horse. All the people cluster around Ray, and then I go off and talk with Ron Cobb about what's really going on at the studio. And that was wonderful fun. But as we're going home, Ray is saying, yeah, Spielberg was going to sign up to do something with It This Way Comes. He says, and he doesn't call me anymore. You know, what am I, a Jewish mother? and to realize there was a kind of a tragic moment here, you know, because Spielberg had signed up, and I talked to Ray and I say, Ray, I don't think he can afford to right now. He's just had 2 bombs. He's had 1941, and he produced Sgt. Pepper's. And he has 1 more chance in the barrel before Hollywood starts to write him off. And this was just too chancy. And Ray sits there, oh, I suppose. So eventually he and Spielberg did reestablish their friendship and everything, but that's the horror of working in Hollywood, is you think everyone's in love with each other and friendly and you have great meetings, and then shit happens. And boy, did Ray go through the shit in Hollywood. He lost, you know, they'd screwed up Martian Chronicles, his prime novel. He hated the producer thereafter, just couldn't stand to talk about it. So what Ray did was he immersed himself in drama. He funded plays in Hollywood. And we would go to a studio playhouse, and they would put on Fahrenheit 451 or the Martian Chronicles, and he just loved drama. He loved to finance these things. The one thing that he didn't quite succeed in 1972 was Leviathan 99. It's a lot of money. It's Douglas Trumbull doing lighting and effects. It's Ray Bradbury. It's Ray Bradbury's script based on Moby Dick. It's MGM Studios, a huge soundstage being converted into a playhouse. Really quite an interesting production. It closes a week later. And Ray writes to me and says, well, there's old pie-faced Ray. I've got to go back on the lecture circuit and pay off $80,000 in bills. Yeah. You know? So being in on this and seeing a man go through this, the agony, the ecstasy, and still being that loving guy was just extraordinary. And to lose him, you'll read the story of our last meeting with Ray in the program book, but it's hard to get used to life without him.
Yeah.
Thank you. Really?
Oh, there we go, good.
Look, theirs isn't tipsy.
No, they got
Ours is stable. Or something I am. Well, Greg has touched on so much of my involvement with Ray has also been with Greg. When my mother drove us to that Ray Bradbury lecture, early on I had gotten some resistance about from home about, well, science fiction is that good for a kid, and monster magazines, Mad magazine, and that sort of thing. And my mother consented to be one of the chaperones for this thing, and drove a group of us there. And after hearing Bradbury speak, that was it. If Ray Bradbury said it was okay, it was okay. And that absolutely smoothed the way. So just that was a big influence. But what Ray said at that meeting, and said basically I think every time I ever saw him, his advice to all the young people is to not be cool. Don't be cool about things. Be hot, be enthusiastic. Find those things that make you passionate, and go for it, and enjoy whatever it is you're doing. Enjoy doing that, and that has stayed with me all my life, and many different things that I've done. as an influence. So like a lot of people who knew Ray, met him, I had an encounter with him. That's the thing that stayed with me. I wanted to comment about the 2 Bradbury meals for some reason. One is when we went to, Ray invited us to come visit him at his office, as Greg was talking about, and very much like Mark's description. And he took us to lunch at this very elegant restaurant, and we young guys knew nothing about elegant restaurants, and we looked for the hamburger on the menu, having been trained by our parents to not order an expensive thing, and besides what we like is hamburgers.
And nothing was cheap at Frascati.
No, the burger was expensive. I was a little, oh my, can I do that? But so anyway, we ordered burgers, and Ray looks at us, and then he tells us a story. Was it when...
we went in 1944 Guanajuato.
First infusion of money, and he went to Mexico to visit Mexico. Just a young guy, and with some friends. And he went down there and got down into Mexico, and which he wrote about, an essay about these mummies in the catacombs there. And they went out to a restaurant the first night that he was there, and he looked at the menu, which was all in Spanish, of course. And he looked for the hamburger, which growing up in LA in the Depression is all he had ever eaten. And he had hamburgers, everything, that's what he ate. And he looked at the menu, and there were no hamburgers on there. What there was steak, and really good steak. And so he ordered the first steak that he ever had. And he said, I liked it, and I then made it a practice to order, when I could afford it, to order steak. So don't feel shy about, but you're okay with a hamburger if that's what you want, too. And so the effect was very much to put us at ease.
Which he always did.
Yeah. Then the second story relates to the very first San Diego Comic Convention, and which was held in the basement, and now called the Celestial Room of the El Cortez Hotel. Celestial because it has no view at all. It's completely underground.
No stars.
Not one window, not a star. The only stars were Ray Bradbury and Jack Kirby. And being one of the committee people, and it came time for lunch, we realized we had no effective budget for wining and dining or anything like that, and our idea to go eat was across the street from the Cortez was a cafeteria, and so a group of us.
That was just the first one?
This is the first one.
Yeah.
The El Cortez you're talking about.
Not the Cortez, I'm sorry, the
U.S.
Grant, I beg your pardon, the U.S. Grant. And right across 4th Avenue there was a cafeteria in the middle of the block. So off we go, and Greg's, I think, is on one side, and I'm on another side, and we're talking about this, and you see, we're sorry, Ray, this is, we're going to go to this cafeteria. I hope that's okay. And he said, well, I don't know if it's called Losfus at the time. It's Clifton's cafeteria.
Los Angeles Science Fiction League.
The Los Angeles Science Fiction League met famously at Clifton's, and he launched into a story about going to Clifton's and about how that's, was a big part of his social life and the center of fandom in LA at the time, and they had a very nice banquet every week at this cafeteria, and there he was, completely putting us at ease about this. I mean, we're taking the guy to the cafeteria instead of a banquet. What kind of convention is this, But he was very cool about it. And then,
all you could eat.
And I don't remember, I don't know if it was that year or it was from the El Cortez, at the El Cortez. We went to the El Cortez. It started a little tradition of the closing night of going to Di Felipe's Italian restaurant on India Street, and Ray and Bob Clampett, I remember going one year, and we had these wonderful post-convention banquets in Di Felipe's under the Chianti bottles. There used to be Chianti bottles up there signed by Ray and Bob and Chuck Jones and other people who went to those early dinners, which were wonderful. And, anyway, I don't have anything otherwise too earth-shaking to say, but just some memories of Ray. Remains a big influence on me to this day. Thank you.
Mark, when I was listening to you talk, I could understand everything you said. I knew of Bradbury before I met him. I'd read his stuff, and I really considered him exciting, and I would have given anything to meet him, but I didn't know how one would go about that. I met Charles Beaumont and Richard Matheson, William F. Nolan. They all knew Bradbury, for God's sakes. That was to me so exciting. One year, Charles Beaumont took me as a guest with him to a meeting at the Café de Paris in Hollywood on Sunset. And it was called The Fictioneers. And a bunch of half a cent, a quarter of a cent word writers would gather together once a year, and they had become a kind of a large group of professional, basically pulp writers. Guys like William R. Cox and William Campbell Galt and people like that. And I was excited to go as Charles's guest. I met Paul Anderson there. A whole flock of people that I had known, Clifford Simic, another. And so he took me as his guest, and I got a chance to watch Bradbury talk. I fell in love with him the first time I heard him speak. I followed him over to, Robert Kirsch had a writing class at the university. He was the editor of, the book editor at the LA Times. And so when I talked to Kirsch and asked him, could I monitor his class if he's going to have Bradbury as a guest? And I saw a man in an ice cream suit, pair of glasses, somewhat awkward talking to crowds. I remember he put his hand on his head. I found myself thinking of Stan Laurel. As he was talking, he was sort of unaware of what he was doing. He was thinking so hard. Anyway, through Beaumont, Matheson, Nolan, I met Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury wasn't quite sure about me at all, because the first thing he told me was, don't talk. What are you saying to me? But he said, no, you will wear the energy off of it. And I said, Ray, I'm like one of those comedians. I gotta work the thing out and get the kinks out of it in front of people. If I can tell it effectively enough, then I know how to go about writing it. Nonsense, nonsense, he said. He said a lot of interesting things. One of them that really fascinated me was writers should not have cars. They can't afford them. Well, that was me. I really could not afford a car. So I started to follow Bradbury around. He became really the most important influence in my life. I wanted to be him. I would have given anything to be Ray Bradbury, to meet the kind of people he had the opportunity on almost a daily basis to meet, the kind of access he had, and the fact that he was young, handsome, modest, and very, very talented. And I started stealing his ideas. He wrote a wonderful story called Death and the Maiden, in which this maiden is in this tower, and this beautiful man on a fiery horse rides up and sees her in the window and stops beside the little stream and takes out the guitar, and he begins to serenade the young woman. She's very flattered. She's watching him. And he says, why don't you come down here and join me? And she says, no, my father told me to stay inside because if I stayed in here, I would never die. And so he doesn't want me going outside. So this young man on the horse talks to her a little bit more and sort of flirtatiously. And after a while, she goes down, gets on the back of his horse, and they go off. And this was Death and the Maiden. And I stole that and made Nothing in the Dark out of it with Gladys Cooper and Robert Redford for the Twilight Zone. Changed everything. But the idea that death is not bad. Death is part of the game. And it would not have been designed as part of the game unless there was something really, really positive about it. That fearing death was a real, real mistake, because death doesn't try to hurt anybody. Death is gentle. People tell you on their deathbeds that all of their pain is gone. And that at a certain moment their face lights up as though they're seeing beyond the grave to something you haven't seen before. And I'd read all these accounts and I had all this sense of it. But here was a story that showed me that death was not malignant. I stole that idea. And I made a very good story out of it. I made a joke the other day. It may not be dandelion wine, but it's dandelion beer. So, now back to Bradbury. I loved the man. I wanted to be him. When I would meet him, I would be thrilled and totally excited. And at this meeting of the Fictioneers, after it was all over, people went down to the bar. Half of them went home. The rest went down to the bar. I went down. Standing at the bar, I had ordered a glass of wine, waiting for it to be delivered, and somebody pushes his way in beside me, and I look around, and it's Ray Bradbury, getting the attention of the barkeeper, asking for some wine, and I'm standing there waiting for mine, and utterly thrilled. Now, this was the first time I talked to him. So I said to him, Ray Bradbury, you don't know who I am, but I would like to be a writer too. I'm working at it. And I read your story, Icarus Will Go For Your Right, in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And it was so goddamn beautiful. And I think it would make an absolutely splendid, semi-animated cartoon, an animated story. And he didn't know what the hell to make of that. But we ended up getting our drinks and talking some more about it. And in the course of it, he said, God bless you, my child. Go write a script on it if you want to, and but let me give you some advice. Don't disturb your regular work schedule. At the end of the day, before you put the cover on the typewriter, type out 1 page. At the end of 30 days, you'll have a script. I was so proud and happy that he had advised me, and I went home that night and wrote the damn script. And I mailed him a copy of it, and he ran it through his typewriter and had Kinko's or some company make 20 copies of it and gave me a couple of them. And I gave one of them to a guy who took it over to Format Films. And Format was a group of really wonderful artists who had divorced UPA. They had quit. And they were the people who had made, what is that thing about Willie the Kid and Mr. Magoo and things like that. They all came out of this group of people who now had a little company. And I showed them the script and they were interested in it. And the next thing you know, we arranged a meeting between them and Ray and me, in which I learned another great lesson. Ray Bradbury, from time to time, or at least one time, that really was very effective. Somebody was giving him advice on where they were going to do or what was happening. And Ray was a very peculiar guy. He said, well, let me be contrary. And stopped their talk. And then he was contrary. He told them they were full of it. You know, that's not the way. This is the way. Here's what we're thinking about. And they said, well, what about the artists? Who should we do it with? So Ray and I arranged to go over to Joe Magnani's house. Joe was the head of the art department at the Otis Art Institute, a very excellent teacher, writer, been at it for many years, had lithographs in the Library of Congress, famous man. And he was prepared, because he had illustrated stuff for Bradbury before, to go to work on it. I took with me Bert Schonberg, Kathleen Frankenstein, that painter. And because I wanted Bert to do it. But Bert never even really got a chance to make a presentation. He sat there and watched us, watched Ray, hire Joe, and the next thing you know, we were having another meeting at Format Films, and they embraced Joe, gave him office space to work in if he wanted it. He could work at home if he wanted to. Joe made 3,000 sketches about this big, and we picked out 300 of them. We laid them out on the floor, and we walked in among them, looking at these little sketches, trying to figure out how they might relate to the movie. We picked out 300 of them. I think Joe took out of that 100 of them that he thought would be effective, and he made cell paintings about this big. And they put them under a flatbed editing machine so that they could have the camera above the artwork, and they could slowly move in on the artwork. They could slowly truck across it. They could cut abruptly from one thing to another. They could superimpose almost all of it on this damn machine. And as a course, the plan was we had rented a copy of a film by a man named Singer, which was called Titan, and it was a film about Michelangelo's statue David. And the camera slowly moved around David and dissolved through. There goes the camera again, dissolved through. And you would look at this, and the statue hasn't moved a bit, but when you move the camera, you move the viewpoint, and the stone statue came alive in that film. And we were trying to do it like that. Because I had then an idea, and I'm still working on it, called illustrated radio. And I made up this thing in my head when I would hear it being done in sound. And then along came the CD, and it was a wonderful chance to make CDs. But the idea of making a DVD out of a CD by adding visuals to it was in my head. And I had been talking to Ray about this way to make a film, and he slowly bought the idea, although later he told me he never believed in it, he didn't think it would work, and that he was wrong. It was wonderful to hear him say it. I was wrong, and you were right. Because he had always been nagging me. Almost every time I met him, he went into a little diatribe, almost at a certain point became obnoxious. He would tell me, George, you should stop judging your own work. You're not qualified to do that. Send it to an editor. There are editors out there that would buy anything you've written. You've got a ton of things in your, I've listened to you tell me about stuff you're doing. Send it out, God bless you, but stop sitting on it. Stop trying to, I, again, paid no attention to Ray, and again, very carefully chose people I was going to show things to, and I didn't want to show anything to anybody unless I was convinced that it was absolutely wonderful. Anyway, I've known Ray over 50 years. I went to his house. He was in his early 90s. Well, one other thing first before I tell you that. His birthday. And at the 87th birthday, among other things, I introduced him, and Nolan was there, and Nolan gave him a citation from the Nobel Committee, a certificate of some kind. They had chosen Ray. Here he is at the very top of his form in this mystery and imagination bookstore. And he saw me, because I had some praise for him to the audience, and he told the story about Icarus. And he told him almost everything I told you, in which he made me the hero of the story, and that all these years, he says, I've been claiming Icarus will go up your right, but it really belongs to George. It's George's thing, because I didn't believe it would work. Well, since then I've got a copy of the Icarus, and I have inserted Icarus right into that damn film. And I have a little film called Ray Bradbury's 87th birthday. At that birthday, one of the things he said to everybody when it was time to blow out the candle of the big cake we furnished to him, and he blew out the candle and everybody said, make a wish, Ray. And Ray looked around and said, my wish is that you all live to be 87 years old. And that was like a reprieve to me, because if God doesn't listen to Ray Bradbury, who the hell does he listen to? So since then I've expected to be at least 87 before I go, because Ray told the universe that that was the way it was going to be. And I hope that it turns out that I have another 4 years of life, because I'm 83. And I will wish that he was around to change the date on. Anyway, I will tell you another interesting fact. Because I adored him so much, he was always over my head. Same thing with Charles Beaumont. When I met Beaumont, I knew he was a better writer than me. I knew I could learn from him. I was honored and proud to be his friend and spend 2, 3, 4 days a week in his presence. But as long as Charles Beaumont was around, he was up there and I was down here. When Ray Bradbury died, Charles Beaumont, before him died, I could feel invisible handcuffs going off of me. Now I can show off a little bit because I don't have to acknowledge that this guy's the giant. You know, he's no longer around, we don't need to worry about him. Now, I am the giant. I let myself go because of that. But I will tell you, nothing has ever diminished my love for him. I chose him as a role model. He never, ever let me down. His heart was big as anything you can think of. His ideas were absolutely electric. He knew how to take a single word and make a paragraph out of it. Night, period, new paragraph. And you read that and you come to, and it shocks you. Because it's so electrically, volatilely, it is in motion. His stories are always, anyway, I could talk about Ray Bradbury for hours and hours. I know an awful lot about him now, but I feel, I wish he was still up here. I wish that I would have to defy him every time I told a story out loud in order to find out if it really worked. You know, how to cut it to the bone. The less words, the better. You know, no single word should be on that page that isn't absolutely essential to that story. If you can take that word out without hurting the story, take that damn word out. And he showed me how to what he called cut. The greatest lesson I ever learned from Ray Bradbury was cutting. It's actually editing. But with the way he would do it, is he would, well, I wrote a story called A Bicycle Like a Flame. He read the story and wrote me a note about how much he enjoyed it, how lovely it was. He said, it's beautiful, and he said that 6 times. Beautiful, 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 beautiful. There's only one thing wrong with it. And I asked him what that was, and he said, it's 16 pages, the way you've written it. It's a 12-page story. So take 4 pages out of it, but don't lose anything. I thought, this man is insane, but I'm going to do it. And I found ways to abridge, to compress, to combine paragraphs, to eliminate paragraphs, and I learned the great secret, cutting. Because I found out, in my experience, that scripts for television, for example, or for movies, they're not written, they're rewritten. You'll never see a movie that hasn't gone through several drafts. And in that compression, that cutting, that new idea, a couple of extra words adds a whole new dimension to a piece of work. And if I am successful at what it is that I do, a large amount of praise for that goes to Ray Bradbury. But Charles Beaumont, William F. Dolan, Richard Matheson, Robert Sheckley, Robert Bloch, Fritz Leiber, Theodore Sturgeon. I could go on for another 15 or 20 minutes about the number of people who are so goddamn good at what they do that anybody who reads their work will learn something from it if they really want to. Anyway, thank you.
The treasure. Let's enjoy him for the next 4 years.
Oh, people are going to be watching me fall off the world. There, good riddance, he's gone at last.
We have only a few more minutes. Is there anything that the people in the audience would like to ask about Ray to the people here who knew him, or any thoughts you have you want to add? Good, I'll tell a story. I told earlier about, David reminded me of something. I told you how my friends went to interview Ray, and he kept saying over and over again, you guys remind me of me when I was a kid. And then for the last half of that conversation, he was talking a lot about, talking to me because I was the aspiring professional writer and no one else in that group. Actually, 1 or 2 of those guys did become professional writers, but they weren't at that point in that track. And he kept talking to me about how you can become a writer. So I went back home that night, I told my parents I met Ray Bradbury. And I was maybe 14 at the time, 13 at the time. And I knew I wanted to be a professional writer. I knew it since I was about 8. But my parents were not yet sold on this idea that this was a career. My father worked for the Internal Revenue Service. So the only writers he met were broke. He never met were broke. And they were like, not sure they shouldn't encourage me in other directions. And when I told them about this nice meeting with Ray Bradbury, my mother said, "You taped this, right?" And I said, "Yeah, one of the other guys has the tape." She says, "Can we hear it?" And I just remembered this. And I said, "I don't know, why not?" So I got the tape from my friend, and she said, "Just play the part where he's talking to you." And on the tape, my mother and father heard Ray Bradbury saying, encouraging me, saying, "You can be a great professional writer, you can have a career, you know, you've got the idea, you've got, you know." And remember, Ray Bradbury had never read anything I'd written, but he was judging me based on the things I had said. And my parents kind of approved of me becoming a writer more after that. It was one of the things that a name writer, a real honest-to-God writer had said it was possible I could have a career. I remember, I'd forgotten about that, and something you said triggered that about in it. Ray was a very good friend, and we should talk about the comic convention. Ray was a very good friend of the comic convention. And I think one of the many important things that made the San Diego convention exist was that Ray led his endorsement to it early on. He was one of the first people that Shell, or for other, I think it was Shell who approached him initially, got his support on it. He gave it enthusiastically, without condition. "Yes, I'll be there, I'll give a talk, I'll endorse you." And they bragged about Ray a lot in the ads and the publicity. That was a bit, Ray Bradbury and Jack Kirby were the two big names for the first couple San Diego conventions.